next speaker I'd like to introduce will come per Zoom to us in this room. Tony Waldner. He is from Forest River Hutterite Colony community in North Dakota. He talks about the extinct Hutterite colony, the Milltown colony in South Dakota.
First of all, good day, everyone. It is a great privilege to be able to present at this important event. And could we say maybe an event long overdue. As you can see on the screen, I was asked to present the book I wrote recently on Milltown Hutterite Colony in South Dakota, which has been unoccupied since 1923. Most Hutterite colonies of a century ago were located in southeast South Dakota, including, of course, Milltown. The layout of the colony, as shown, has a public road through the colony with buildings on both sides nearly the length of 1 kilometer. On one side of the road is the James River, and on the other side was a hill ascending to about 50 feet in elevation. Here are a few buildings. The horse barn was built in 1916. And this is another slide of a house that from 1918 on the top and on the bottom. Actually, a medical doctor bought the property after Milltown moved to Canada, and he lived in this house until about the year 2000. But unfortunately, this house burned to the ground in 2007. Another picture of a row of buildings on the other side of the road next to the river. And this is the flour mill and the dam, which caused much controversy as it is explained in the book. And finally, this is a homemade memorial stone located in the cemetery on the hill. Every colony to this day has their own cemetery. Milltown was the first successful colony established by Bonhomme Colony. Early on in America, the Hutterites saw a need to form daughter colonies when the population rose to 120 to 150 people. The title of my book, Reviving Memories, is deliberate. The memory of this colony has faded with subsequent generations. So the title of the book is very fitting in that it seeks to revive a history that was in danger of going lost. The first question that an author must ask is, who is my audience? Anybody with an interest in Hutterite history will find the book fascinating, but every colony that descends from Milltown, South Dakota will take a special interest in the characters and the stories handed down from generation to generation. They will have heard many of the stories from their parents and grandparents. Since Hutterites of that generation rarely left home, their world centered around the colony. Therefore, I have found the retelling of these stories are very uniform. And so as not to lose the audience, this book was not written as a thesis, but rather for the general public. Reviving Memories could be put into the category of human interest, or perhaps it could even be called a sentimental journey into the past. But it is also of historical significance in that it records everyday events of a century ago. Hutterites themselves will readily notice what customs have been retained and which have changed. Their problems and the solutions thereof from a century ago are also highlighted. One often hears of the good old days. For Milltown, these were not easy times. The residents of Milltown were first and second generation communitarians. They had come from the Russian Empire, where 2 generations of Hutterites had lived in private ownership. It took several generations to learn to live together in community. It was a huge task for these founders to come to a consensus about how a community should be organized. What responsibility belongs to the colony leadership, and what authority would the managers of the individual enterprises have? There was a fair amount of bickering, for a lack of a better word. These problems would have been less in private ownership, but they persevered because they truly believed in their cause. They firmly believed that they were in the will of God in preserving the principles of their forefathers. They had a rich heritage of nearly 400 years to strengthen them in their resolve. We also get a glimpse of how they arrived at decisions. More readily than today, a vote was taken when 2 or 3 disagreed to a given proposal. Also, they made more use of the church council, what is known as the Zeugbrüder, and they also asked the advice of the whole brotherhood very frequently. Today, with larger enterprises and more management autonomy, there is a tendency to merely inform the brotherhood as opposed to asking them for advice. But how did this shift happen? Whereas a century ago, all the men were involved in building, farming, and the livestock operation, today one is less informed on the needs of the individual enterprises. Therefore, the advice of the enterprise manager is more often sought out. The manager of the colony usually permits this when he sees that the enterprise is financially viable. In other words, are the enterprises making good decisions, and is the colony moving forward financially? Now I'd like to present the insights of retired professor Dr. Leonard Gross and why his insight is important. He writes in a letter, quote, "I enjoyed reading through the volume. In a very direct way, it continues the tradition of the Gross and Kleingeschichtsbücher. Given the Hutterian colony compositions that developed here in North America, there will never again be one continuous story to tell, at least in the manner of the original Geschichtsbücher. The story now needs to be piecemeal, with your new volume being one of these pieces. You have the important knack of interjecting elements that can so soon be forgotten. For example, on page 106 and 107, you mentioned the transformation of the word Gemeinde to society and finally to colony. You give significant details on changes in colony procedures. You have stories of women, a needed corrective to much of the historical presentations in the past. And you're portraying the story of one colony in great detail, grants insights that would not be possible in a more general approach to Hutterian history." End of quote. Here I agree wholeheartedly that in the future, every colony needs to record and to collect information for future generations. By researching Milltown, South Dakota, I have realized how much history has gone lost. The early years in America were pioneer years with little thought of recording current events. There were too few Johannes Waldners who did a fantastic job in his Denkwürdigkeiten in writing his memoirs, what is now known as the Kleingeschichtsbuch. However, the last part of the Kleingeschichtsbuch, where the history in America is recorded, we relied for the first time on a non-Hutterite to write it, namely Professor Ziegelschmidt. Of course, he is to be commended for his efforts. However, he left many gaps that could have been and should have been filled in by Hutterian historians of the day. For example, The top question being asked by current Hutterites is, how come we started out in America under one elder and ended up with 3 major conferences, now 4 if the Schmiedeloid schism should be permanent? The answer is not given in the Kleingeschichtsbuch, a major omission if one were to take a survey. However, these are issues and events that can only be touched on in such a history of an individual colony. So the above subject is covered in the book, but very briefly. Even though these early colonies, with the exception of Bonhomme, lived in very close proximity to each other, and there were marriages from one conference to another, there was, however, an invisible dividing line. It seems when 3 strong-willed leaders start a movement, namely the reestablishment of communal living, there is also a tendency to become dogmatic with one's own ideas and mindset. They agreed 100% with the Hutterian doctrines, but the customs they felt important were somewhat different. In reality, though, they had very much in common. As long as the Schmiedeloid, Lereloid, and Dariusloid lived together in South Dakota, they readily visited each other. Their ministers had services together as well as funerals. Later, when the Hutterites were looking for land in Canada, their goal was to find enough acreage in one area for all 3 conference groups. There are also a few chapters in the book concerning the livelihood of Milltown, which was very similar to other Hutterite colonies of their day. In this newly settled area of America's hinterland, additional acreages were available at very low prices or through the Homestead Act. However, the grain yields were very low compared to today. So one of the top priorities was to build a flour mill. It was a profitable enterprise to make flour for the surrounding population. Their close proximity to a river was also of a great advantage for a water wheel-driven mill. Further, the general farming operation is also touched on. One interesting aspect, which Hutterites generally don't think about, is how they embraced the latest technology, continuing up to the present. Whereas the faith-related Amish stuck with horses for field work, it seemed the Hutterites of a century ago took full advantage of the most technological advancements in farming. If life could be made easier and produce more, it was seen as okay. Stationary gasoline engines, followed by tractors, were adopted as early as 1900. Ironically, trucks were not adopted right away. Perhaps the need for them was not necessary, with a train loading station for livestock and grain elevators within a few miles from every colony. But in common with the Amish, the Hutterites were cautious with the use of the car. The first restriction pertaining to cars was in 1930. This ruling prohibited the ownership of a passenger vehicle. Maybe it was seen as pleasure-provoking or needless traveling. Although ownership of vehicles was prohibited, colonies were permitted to borrow or rent a car 25 times a year. But it must have been very handy, for we find it being up to 30 times a year only a year later. Reviving Memories devotes several chapters to the migration from South Dakota to Canada. The Hutterites settled in a country of military might, and one that was proud to be known as a protector of freedom. The Hutterites saw themselves as a people who sojourned in this world, but took no part in an earthly kingdom. They were, therefore, seen as poor citizens of the United States, and it did not help that they were of German ancestry when World War I pitted the United States against the German lands. This perception that the Hutterites make poor citizens is well documented, both in South Dakota as well as later in Canada. As late as 1947, during the debate on Hutterite expansion in Canada, a journalist asked a colony manager if Hutterites considered themselves to be good citizens. This quick-thinking manager answered with another question, quote, "Are industrious people good citizens? Are citizens good if they obey the laws, pay taxes, produce an abundance of goods, live according to the teachings of Christ? If they are good citizens, because good fruit cannot grow on bad trees. By their fruits they shall be known." End of quote. In 1918, the Hutterites had well built up colonies in South Dakota with many self-made buildings out of stone. Therefore, the Hutterite leaders made a gallant effort to reach a compromise with the government concerning their demand of military service. There were 56 young Hutterite men, mostly married with children, confined in military training camps. Today, with a population of 50,000, it would amount to 1,500 young men being imprisoned. So we can appreciate the concern and that this was indeed a crisis situation. My research discovered a travel log of Milltown minister Joseph Kleinsasser, which revealed 6 trips to Washington, D.C. Their destination was the War Department and discussions with their state representatives. At first, they sought a compromise with the government, but later journeys to Washington, D.C. sought permission to emigrate to Canada, which happened in the years between 1918 and 1934. Education in America for Hutterites is also briefly covered in this book. Whereas today a majority of Hutterite colonies still hire an outside teacher using a public school curriculum, these founding colonies all had their own teachers by 1918. The colonies sent their brightest men who had an aptitude for teaching for a summer course at a local Institute of Higher Learning. After a short instruction period, they had to pass a test in every subject deemed important in that day. Milltown was the first to have their own English teacher in 1889, at a time when the majority of adults could only speak broken English. This person also taught German religious instruction, a full day's work indeed. In Milltown, the first 3 teachers selected all became ministers and eventually elders or ältester in the church. They were Joseph Kleinsasser, Peter Hofer, and Joseph Kleinsasser Jr. This shows what importance they placed on a good elementary education, although they saw little need for further formal education. They did, however, attend workshops and training sessions, also mentioned in the book, when the need arose. So, as mentioned before, all subjects and events are briefly covered to give an overall view of the history of this colony. In closing, I would like to commend the efforts of all attendees who analyzed the Ontarian past to make sense of, of the present and to forge a better path for the future. In a tradition-based society such as the Hutterites are, it is of paramount importance for the younger generation to attain a sense of where their forebears have been and what they stood up for. No culture appears out of thin air. Thank you.